Now, can everyone hear me? Good. What about if I stand here? Not so well. All right, I'll try and lean in. I think that sounds better, doesn't it? So just before we start, I wanted to thank Neil and Thomas for inviting me. In a way, this is a kind of a homecoming to me, because I was actually born in Preston, which is just up the road. And I've not actually been back here for, well, quite a long time. So for me, you know, I'm born Lancastrian, if not bred. So thank you for inviting me. And I'm very excited to be here today talking about the exciting topic of monsters. Now, I suppose the genesis of this talk happened last year when I was in Norway. I was travelling down the coast on a ship, and we went past this very interesting looking mountain. And as you can see, it's got a hole right through it. And I thought, what the hell is that? So I turned to a couple of people that were stood near me, Norwegians on the deck. I think they were truck drivers. And I said, what caused that hole in the mountain? And I was expecting them to say, well, you know, like in the last ice age, there was a geological event that caused erosion of... But they didn't. They said, well, as a matter of fact, there were 7 troll maidens frolicking in the sea. And then there was another troll who took a fancy to them, and he was watching them. And then he came out of the sea and started chasing them around, trying to catch one of them to have his way with it. And this caused a huge fuss and awoke the troll king who was nearby. And he was just about to get one of them, and she managed to run away, and he was so angry that he got out his bow and arrow and fired an arrow at her. And the Troll King, just in time, threw his hat, and the arrow pierced the hat. And at that exact moment, the sun came up. Everybody turned to stone, including the hat. And then basically, that is how the mountain was formed, is what I was told. I was like, okay. So since then, I've delved deeper and deeper into Scandinavia, and I've found out that the whole place is a kind of an enchanted land where very few people live. So what I wanted to say was I want to consider like what a troll is and what a monster is. And there's a little bit of a synchronicity going on here with our last talk with Neil and Kate. So honestly, we didn't talk to one another beforehand. So the word monster comes from the Latin word monstrum, which means that which is revealed. So we often think of a monster as being a scary being. It could be from another dimension, or it could be a cryptid, or it could be something completely different. But the original word means just something that is revealed to us. And it also means that it's a warning, like a warning from this other place. So monsters are beings that in some way need to be revealed and must be warned about. And Scandinavia in the Arctic North is, in my opinion, a land of myth and enchantment. Much of it's still wild and desolate. If you go there, I'm sure many of you have been there, you'll see lonely mountains, immense fjords, caves, icy landscapes, but what you won't see is many people. So the human density, population density is very low. And also it's one of the areas of Europe that was the latest to be converted to Christianity. And I think that has, meaning for what we're going to talk about today. So there's also tribal people living in Scandinavia. We're talking about the Sami, but I'm also going to be talking about the Arctic North, specifically Greenland. And I was very fortunate enough to have been to Greenland recently. I was there for 3 weeks. I got back 2 weeks ago. And I was blown away by the amount of mythology and the magical culture, shamanic culture that still exists there. So in other words, the Arctic North and Scandinavia are perfect places for magical beings to exist in. But I'm going to be asking the question, are they real? So I think what we need to do is consider 3 different ways to think about it. So the first scenario is that monsters don't exist. They're just figments of our imagination. The second one is that monsters do exist, but only certain people can actually see them or interact with them. And the third scenario that we're going to be considering is that monsters do exist, and they can interact with us, whether you believe in them or not. So anyhow, let's go back to the beginning. Since time immemorial around the world, all cultures have been reporting encounters with strange beings, some of them terrifying and deadly, but others are helpful and friendly. Across cultures, tribes, nations and territories, many of these beings share common characteristics. Encounters with them have always been taken seriously, and each culture has specialists, often shamans, who are able to interact with them and bring back knowledge from these other realms after encounters with these creatures. So this is the situation as it was for thousands of years, but all that was about to change. So the scientific revolution came along in the 16th and 17th centuries, and basically what the scientific revolution did is that it decreed that there's no such thing as anything that's unseen, and the physical world of 5 senses is all that exists. All of a sudden, the universe, far from being a cosmos, became just a place of dead atoms and dead matter. Life itself was an accident, a kind of a chemistry soup that had somehow accidentally been brought to life, if you like. So everything that didn't fit into this new model, and that included things like magic, alchemy, monsters, was tossed on the scrap heap and called mumbo jumbo. And because of this, monsters could not be said to exist. But the monsters didn't care. So despite the scientific revolution, people still carried on having all these experiences. And all sorts of non-human beings, monsters, ghosts, elves, sprites, gnomes, fairies, whatever you want to call them, people still encountered them. But often these encounters took place in areas away from human beings and civilizations. The encounters tended to take place in forests or mountains, places like that, away from the towns and the cities. And all the stories of these encounters, which didn't fit the official narrative anymore, they were all put into a category which we might call folklore. And folklore is just a kind of an unofficial version of history. However, one man who was very interested in Scandinavia decided that it was high time to record some of this folklore before it disappeared for good, because mostly it was just passed down through stories and not written down. So that man was William Craigie. He was a Scottish academic, he was a lexicographer, and he was an editor of the Oxford English Dictionary. So he knew a few things about words. He also taught himself several Scandinavian languages, and he set off on a number of adventures across many Scandinavian countries. And when I say Scandinavia, I'm primarily talking about Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Iceland. Obviously, Finland is part of Scandinavia, but often people interchange the term Norse and Scandinavian. I'll be interchanging that a bit, but I mean the same thing. So he spoke several languages fluently, and he travelled extensively, and he wrote a book which is called Scandinavian Folklore, Illustrations of the Traditional Beliefs of the Northern People. And that book was very popular at the time, And he became a professor. He was the professor of Anglo-Saxon studies at Oxford University. And one of his students was highly taken with his work and his research. And his student had a very inventive imagination. You may have heard of him. So Tolkien, who I just found out actually died yesterday, 50 years ago, to the day. So the very first day of the Mysterious Earth Conference was his 50th anniversary death. He decided that he felt the need to create a kind of a modern epic in the Anglo-Saxon literary style, because he didn't think that we had one. So he took a lot of the work by William Craigie and added his own imagination to it, and that's how we ended up with The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion, all the rest of it. And he drew heavily on Norse and Celtic mythology, and he included a lot of the magical beings that we all know and love, such as trolls, goblins, dwarves, giants, dragons. Now, as I mentioned, I've been very fortunate recently to go to Greenland, and I wasn't intending on including Greenland in this talk, but the opportunity came up and I went, and I was absolutely amazed by the amount of magical lore that they have there. So I thought, why not include it? So Greenland is the world's largest island, if you ignore Australia, which might be considered a continent. In Greenland, they don't call it Greenland, they call it Kalahitnunat. There's only about 50,000 people living there, and given that it's almost the same size as Canada, you can imagine how empty it is. Most of it's covered in an ice cap. Only about 5% of it is inhabited with people around the coastline. And until recently, the culture of the people of Greenland, which is also the Inuit culture, was a spiritual culture that was shamanic in its nature. Many myths and monsters live on there, even though it's been Christianized for well over a century. Here's a few pictures that I took when I was there. The bottom left one is a shamanic mask from East Greenland. Top left is not an ancient stone, I'm afraid to say. It's a modern one, but it seemed to be fitting. There aren't any megaliths in Greenland, as far as we know. It's far too new, if you like. It was covered. The ice cap extended all the way over the edges until relatively recently. Top right picture is myself in front of a mountain known as Heart Mountain, or Umanak. It's about 70 degrees north. I think that's probably the furthest north I've ever been, and probably ever will go. Now, one of the most interesting things I found out about the Inuit people was that they have a very different way of seeing the world to us. For example, the words weather and consciousness are actually the same one. The physical weather is regarded as a kind of psychic weather. And what you can see there is obviously the northern lights, or the aurora borealis. And during the winter, they have 4 months of absolute darkness. And you might think, you or I might think, oh my God, what would I do in 4 months of darkness? But for them, it's actually the most intense time of the year. There's no hunting to be done. There's no fishing to be done. All they can do is sit in the darkness and look at the aurora borealis. And as a matter of fact, they believe that that's the time of year where everybody has a kind of a shamanic ability, and the two worlds, the unseen world and the seen world, merge as one. So during this time, it's a period of immense spiritual revelation for most of the people there. And they see themselves as a unit, their tribe, if you like, as one organism, with people having individuated consciousnesses within it. Unfortunately, missionaries came to Greenland in the 18th century, and decided to convert everybody to Christianity. When I was in Nuuk, which is the capital of Greenland, which is not a very big capital, I might add. I think my hometown of Penzance is actually larger. There's a hill there with a church next to it, and on top of the hill there's a statue of Hans Egede, and he was one of the prime missionaries who came along to convert people, and he founded the settlement of Nuuk. And when I went there, I think it was a Sunday morning, and it was very atmospheric. It was very misty. There was nobody around, apart from that raven, which I put a picture of there. And I walked up to the statue on the hill, and I looked at it. And then down below in the water, you can see that there's this statue of the sea goddess, which is the true deity that Greenlanders revere. And there are many stories about this sea goddess. And the main one is that all of life resides within her hair. So all the whales and the seals and the fish, everything that comes from the sea is released when she combs her very, very long hair. And if people have been not revering her enough or disrespecting the environment or whatever, then there will not be any seals to hunt in the following year. But the interesting thing I found about this whole scene, apart from the eeriness of it, was the fact that Hans Egede you probably can't see it, but he's got red paint all over him. So the locals keep throwing red paint on him, and they keep having to clean it off. Now, there was one man who didn't like this at all, and that man was Knud Rasmussen. And his father was one of the missionaries, and his mother was actually an Inuit. So he lived in a small settlement called Ilulissat, and he grew up, his father was a Danish missionary, I should say, and he grew up wanting to follow the Inuit ways. Even though he was born as a Dane and educated as a Dane, and he lived for a while in Copenhagen and became a theatre producer, I believe, he always wanted to go back to the Arctic and explore it. And very similar to Craigie, he decided that he was going to devote his life to recording all the folklore of the Inuit people before it was lost. And if it wasn't for Knud Rasmussen, we wouldn't know about all the different myths and monsters. And believe me, there are a lot of monsters up there. And he wrote something like 6,000 pages of diary entries, which is a huge treasure trove to us if anybody's interested in researching more about this. I don't think he actually wrote any books as such, just diaries. But he was very alarmed about how Christianity and modernity together were erasing the shamanic culture of the Arctic peoples. He kind of rejected modern society, and he's got a favourite line which I love: "Give me winter, give me dogs, you can keep the rest." So this was his house that I visited. It's been turned into a museum now. A lovely old wooden house. Hopefully those weren't his pet dogs. So if it wasn't for Rasmussen, we may not know about some of the following monsters, and I'm just going to show you a select few. So this is a Kalimatsok, also known as an Arctic ghoul. They're often seen in graveyards. And, in Greenland, there's virtually no topsoil, so graveyards are quite difficult to construct, if you like. You can't bury somebody 6 feet under. So there's a lot of folklore around bodies coming up out of, from the rocks and everything. And this Arctic ghoul, it's said to feed off the northern lights. And they can be heard screaming at full moons. These particular ghouls were called upon by the Angakut, which is what the shamans were called, whenever they were seeking guidance. And interestingly, when I was there was an old Greenlandic woman who was talking to us, and she said that she'd seen these ghouls coming up and feeding off the northern lights. And I was with a lady who was a tourist, and she rather rudely said to this old Greenlandic woman, she said, "Ha, you must be mistaken." And then the old Greenlandic woman said something, and that came back through the interpreter as, "No, it's you who are mistaken." Here's another favourite of mine, the Iqualuswak. So we've all seen Jaws. This is kind of the opposite of Jaws. He's a spirit shark, and he roams around on land, regurgitating food for widows and orphans to eat. So he brings them meat and other foods. And there are, shall we say, reports of him actually marrying certain widows. Pisapinua. No, it's not Donald Trump's latest mugshot. He's a giant Arctic fox with a man's face. And he is known for his strength and his invincibility. So whatever you do, you cannot defeat him. And people who revere him are rewarded with inner strength. His name in Greenlandic is actually the Lord of Strength. A less pleasant character is the Anguak. I probably said that wrong. Hopefully there's no Greenlandic people in the audience today. This is a baby that is deliberately killed at birth by a black magician. This baby then sails the seas in a dog's skull as a kayak, seeking out his victim, because it hones in on a victim. So it can also enter the body of a sibling and eat them from the inside, causing death. So you don't want to meet an Anguak. Can't say that word. Now these are just a few of the other interesting embodied entities, shall we say, that legend has it exist in Greenland and the Arctic. And don't forget that when I'm talking about Greenland and the Arctic itself is a region that sits at the top of the world, and the Greenlandic Inuit people, the Alaskan Inuit people, the Siberian Inuit people, they all share pretty much the same language, the same cultures. And I should point out that I got those images from this fantastic book which I picked up there, the Bestiarium Grönlandica. So anyone interested in seeing these like strange Greenlandic mythological beings, there's your book. But anyhow, that's enough of those monsters. Do these strange creatures really exist? So let's consider the three scenarios that I mentioned earlier on. The first scenario is that monsters don't exist. I mean, this is the default scenario that we're told about in our age at the moment. Monsters exist in movies and they exist in books, but they're really there for our entertainment and our titillation. Otherwise, monsters is just a term that's ascribed to wild animals or murderers or anything we don't really like that is considered to be very dangerous. So, since the cosmos has been declared empty, dead matter, it must therefore be devoid of anything that cannot be detected by scientific methods. Can we detect monsters with scientific methods? But anyhow, there's a logical fallacy in kicking out the monsters. The logical fallacy is that the scientific revolution claimed that only material physicality was real. However, there was no proof of this. No experiments were done to prove that material reality was the only thing. It was purely rhetorical. So by its own standards, it was a non-scientific claim, we could say. So there was no room for monsters in the scientific view of the universe, and they were therefore banished. And there we go, there's a couple of monsters being banished. Second scenario is that monsters may well exist, but only a few people can see them. Some people claim to be able to see enchanted beings such as fairies, and this is where we might have a little bit of crossover with the last talk. It's common for children up to a certain age to be able to see things that others cannot. And I've got a very interesting anecdote later on in my talk about my fairy encounter last year, so stay awake for that. So children can see monsters and other beings that others can't see until they're trained not to be able to see them. So this artist was known as John Bauer. I'm sure many of you have heard of him and you've seen his artwork. He was a Swedish artist. He lived from 1882 to 1918, which, as you can see, wasn't particularly long, and we'll get to that in a moment. So he was interesting because he lived in the Småland forests of central Sweden, and as a child he was just left to roam around the forests at will. And as he grew up, he carried on roaming around the forests at will. So you could say he almost never grew up. And when he was in the forests, he claimed to be able to see and meet and interact with many beings, mostly trolls and gnomes. And he began to paint these things that he saw. And many of his paintings are very beautiful, and they are mostly of enchanted-looking forest scenes with all sorts of magical beings in them. And I'll show you just a couple of his pictures now, and I'm sure you'll immediately recognize them. This is one with a group of trolls. Quite often they feature an enchanted child, which may or may not be him. There's another one. And another one. And I think you'd agree that his art is enchanting and very earthy. So we're talking about mythological creatures of the earth here. But anyhow, he unfortunately died a mysterious death, aged 36. The pressures of modern life got to him, and he got married. Now, his new wife didn't like living in the forest. She considered it a bit backwards, so she wanted to move to Stockholm. So they did move to Stockholm, and they had a child. But then after a while, John Bauer was very unhappy in Stockholm, and he was desperate to move back to the forest. So she agreed, and they moved back to the forest, and then that lasted fine for a couple of years, and then she got restless again, and she said, look, I can't take it here anymore, John, can't stand this forest, we're going to have to move back to Stockholm again. And he was very upset about this, because he loved the forest, and he loved the trolls and the gnomes that lived within it, that he painted. That's where he got his inspiration from. But eventually he agreed. He said, well, all right, we'll get the train back and we'll move to Stockholm. And she said, no, I'm not going to go on a train. Those things are dangerous. And they actually were in those days. So basically, he had to go on a boat. And before he left, he went into the forest to say goodbye to the trolls. And he confided this in a friend. And a troll said to him, don't go on that boat, you'll die. And he went on the boat and he died. The boat was overloaded with sewing machines from the Husqvarna factory. There was a bit of a storm on Lake Vättern, and the sewing machines started moving around on the roof, and it caused the ship to sink. And it sank to the bottom of the lake, and it remained there for 2 years. And then it was raised, the SS Per Brahe, and all of the passengers died, and most of them were still in their cabins within us. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. Once your etheric body disappears, technically you're known as being dead. So this is the closest realm to the physical realm, and there's a considerable crossover between the two. Everything within the world that exists, that is alive, also exists in this etheric realm. Basically, it's the life force. So modern urban developments that we see today, where land has been cleared, industrial buildings have been put up, factories, skyscrapers, they're removing the etheric aspect of that area of the earth. So if you go to places that haven't had that removed, like for example where I live in Cornwall, and you know, there's places all over the country, I'm just singling out Cornwall because it's where I live. Some of the villages there, they haven't changed at all in several hundred years. The houses are still built of stone. There are trees everywhere. If a fairy or a gnome was visiting that village in the 16th century and they came back today, they would recognize it as the same place. That can't be said of certain areas where the entire landscape has been decimated and built upon with motorways, convenience stores, that kind of thing. And for this reason, well, we may as well call them fae, the beings behind that live in the etheric realm, are not able to inhabit that area anymore, so they move off into the more deserted places. So the areas that are left relatively unspoiled are where these beings are still said to dwell. And recently, when I was on my way back from Greenland, I had a few days stopover in Iceland, and I thought, Iceland, elves. So I took the opportunity to go and do a little bit of investigation. And it turns out that 80% of people in Iceland refuse to say that elves don't exist. I don't know what that tells you about it. They won't say that they do, but they refuse to say that they don't. And I met a guy there, and he was telling me about all these construction projects that are happening, that have happened all over Iceland and still happen, whereby certain rocks are said to be inhabited by these elves, or Huldufólk, as they're known in Icelandic. So major projects, the planners have to consult officially appointed seers to consult the elves on their behalf. And if the elves say no, don't move that rock, they don't move it. There have been many, many reports of strange things happening when they ignore those rules. Construction machinery breaks down, people have accidents, all sorts of bad things happen. People have even died for unexplained reasons after destroying rocks. So the picture there is of a particular rock that was in the middle of a housing estate, which nobody dared move, so the houses are built around it. So these are the officially recognised elf sites in Iceland. This is government information, I might add. But what is an elf? So contact with fae and other beings from the etheric realm are said to, in a way, bend your mind. Most people who come into contact with these so-called fae report strange disturbances in their perception of reality. And in these altered states of consciousness, they can take many forms, such as time slowing down or speeding up, a sense of confusion, or things like that. But due to the non-physical nature of the etheric plane, communication partially happens on the level of consciousness. So this is why you often hear people saying, I heard a voice, they spoke to me, but their lips were not moving. Because the etheric plane is not the physical plane, so therefore sound waves can't exist. So we're talking about consciousness here. And this is the part where I relay my strange experience that happened to me last year. So I was walking along the beach. It was a beautiful summer's day. I think it was last August. I was walking the dog, and it was probably about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And there were lots of people on the beach, and the tide was quite far in, so there was probably only about 10 yards between the path I was walking on and the shoreline. And I was walking along, minding my own business. I was in a very relaxed state of mind, and I don't know if that had any bearing on this, but I glanced over at the beach, and I saw a man who was in the water up to his ankles, and he was playing with two children who were swimming in the water, and they were throwing a ball back to one another, and there was also a dog leaping around and barking and having fun with them. Completely normal scene. And there was nothing extraordinary about the day. I mean, on my left-hand side was Morrison's car park. But the strange thing about this man is that he had an orb hovering over his head. And I looked at it and I thought, what the hell's that? And my first thought was as a kid might have one of those bubble blowing things, you know, the ones, and the bubble was hovering over the man. But it was very odd because it was moving around in an erratic manner in the way that bubbles don't. And I looked more closely at it, and it was a kind of an orb about that big, and it was green, blue, and red, and it was kind of pulsating in and out of existence, if you like. And I thought, you know what, maybe he's like fishing, and it's a lure, and he's got a fishing rod in his hand, because of the way it was jumping around like that. And then I looked more closely, no, he didn't have a fishing rod, he didn't seem to notice it. And nobody else was staring at it either. And just at that moment, there was a family walking towards me on the path, and there was a young boy who was about, I'd say, 3 or 4 years old, and he was pointing in that direction. He was going, "Daddy, Daddy, look, fairies, fairies, fairies." And his father was like looking at him, and he was following the line, you know, that he was pointing at. And he said, no, those are not ferries, those are cargo ships. And sure enough, out to sea, there were some ships there. And the boy was going, no, I don't mean that, I mean fairies, can't you see the fairies? And all of a sudden, at that moment, I thought, what the hell am I looking at here? And then it seemed to disappear, and I carried on walking. And then later on, I was like recounting my experience, and I put a post about it on Facebook, and I got loads of people writing to me, saying, oh, what you saw was a plasma fairy. I was like, well, a plasma fairy, what's one of those? So I also looked at the map. I got some maps that Hamish Miller created, Hamish Miller, the famous doubter, because just across the bay was St. Michael's Mount, which is very famous for its conjunction of energy lines. And I realised that the exact point where I saw this strange thing was at the point where I think it's the Mary line enters the sea from the land. So I don't know what bearing that had on it. To me, it's unexplained. So could it all be in the eye of the beholder? We have to consider that because of the reality-changing nature of the encounters, the appearance of monsters, and don't forget when I'm talking about monsters, I'm talking about anything that is being revealed, is said to be seen through the lens of the individual's mind. So a troll may look like a troll because something in our subconscious minds expects it to look like that. And at this point I'm going to bring in our friend Carl Jung. So he would maybe have called this an archetype. Well, what's an archetype? He defined it as a primitive mental image inherited from our earliest human ancestors and present in the collective unconscious. And I like to think of archetypes as, if you think of the psyche as the ocean, our everyday thoughts are like the fish that sort of swim around near the surface. The archetypes are the great whales that swim beneath the surface. But what does this mean for monsters? So we could say that intelligent creatures from the etheric plane could be making incursions into our physical reality at will. Our subjective minds perceive them on the basis of an inherited archetypal template from our ancestors. And this, of course, means that these things can change over time. And that may well be the cultural coding, I think Neil and Kate were talking about earlier on. So we might see fairies now, we might perceive them to be aliens or UFOs. But what do they really look like? And when I say look, I mean look because everything is subjective at this level. They could look like that, and yet we could see them as this. That's my daughters in a forest in Denmark. And these trolls have begun to appear all over the place. I think they started off in Denmark. Local artists have begun creating them. I think there's some now in North America as well. So it appears to me that there's a world of enchantment that may still be alive and experienceable in certain places. And certainly in places like Scandinavia and the Arctic North, there's plenty of space for it to happen. And every culture that ever was has seen the world on multiple levels. They've seen it as packed full of spirits, angels, monsters and gods. Every river, every mountain, cave, forest or glacier or even rocks had a spirit of place associated with it. And that's what we might call animism. But how do we get back to that place? Because I think that's what most of us here would be interested in. We can explore and reconnect. So in 2016, I'll tell you a story about this, because I set off on a quest. I like to call it a quest. It wasn't really a quest. At the time I was very skint and I didn't have a job, and I was feeling a little bit depressed about things. And my mother-in-law said that she would pay for my daughters to go over to Denmark and stay with her for 2 weeks. But unfortunately at the time they were too young to travel on their own. So she said she would pay me to go over there. And I said, okay, fine, I'm not doing anything, I'll go over there. But, and I hope she doesn't actually eventually see this talk, but the thought of spending 2 weeks with my mother-in-law. So I decided instead to set off on a quest. Much more exciting. And I decided to walk as far as I could into Sweden from Denmark. And I wasn't going to take any form of technology along with me. All I was going to take was a couple of paperback books and a camera and a bit of money. I didn't have very much money. I took a tent with me, because in Sweden you can camp wherever you like. There's no law against it. And because of a number of synchronicities began to occur as soon as I started off on my trip. And I found myself eventually being led towards this lake in southern Sweden called Odensjön, which means Odin's lake. And I ended up basically staying in that forest for a couple of weeks actually. And eventually I ended up going to the lake, which is said to be like the Eye of Odin. And subconsciously, I didn't really know what I was doing, but I found myself kind of enacting a ritual, just an instinctive kind of thing that I was drawn towards. So it was almost as though the kind of a spirit of the earth was leading me to this place, and the synchronicities were off the scale, leading me there. And I ended up going into this lake and diving down as deep as I could, and in the middle of the lake. And nobody actually knows how deep this lake is. They say they've tried to fathom it, but they can't detect the bottom. There's a legend actually says that it goes all the way down to some underground tunnels, which then go all the way to Lund, which is a small city in Sweden, I think it's about 20 miles away from there. And that may well be true. But I swam down as deep as I could for some reason, almost like free diving. It was completely black. I was completely naked. and then I had a kind of a very strange vision when I got down there. It was kind of like a Gnostic experience, very difficult to relate, but it was almost like the planet was speaking to me, and it was showing me different versions of the future. And when I came up and sort of recovered myself, I thought, blimey, what was that all about? I thought, I better write a book about this. So I did, and I called that book The Path to Odin's Lake. And that details my journey and my thoughts along the way and all the strange synchronicities that occurred. And it's my opinion that we need to move away now from the materialist paradigm, which has actually brought us so much in terms of, comfort and healthcare and all sorts of other things. But it seems to be a time now where we need to move back into an area of balance. And I think that we need to re-enchant the earth a little bit more. And I think that we can all do that in our everyday lives. It could be things as simple as just picking up acorns and planting trees wherever you go, or clearing litter off waste ground. I mean, there's no such thing as wasteland. Wasteland, whenever I see a piece of wasteland, I scatter flower seeds on it. And I was recently hiking in Madeira, actually, in the mountains, and I came across a small landslip. And in this landslip, the soil was all bare, nothing was growing. So I got some seeds from the trees around, and I planted the seeds in the bare earth. And I sat down on a rock, just admiring my work. And I looked at the rock, and the rock seemed to be looking at me. And there it is. Looks like she's got lipstick on. So yeah, clean up the trash, tread lightly on the earth, talk to the trees, and don't forget there will be signs along the way that we're doing the right thing. And that's all. Thank you very much for listening.